Given how polarized our politics are, sometimes we forget how much consensus there actually is on the biggest economic security issues that we face. For example, what are the fault lines for the economic and technology competition with China? What are the drivers of U.S. competitiveness? What new tools are now available to government and business to secure our markets? And importantly, what capabilities do we desperately need in government today to implement modern economic security policy? It's essential that we engage across left and right, government and business whenever we have the opportunity. And I had one such opportunity last week at the 42nd National Association for Business Economics annual conference here in DC. I was delighted to join a panel of the country's foremost experts, like former U.S. Assistant Secretary for Defense for Industrial Base Policy, Laura Taylor-Kale, former Assistant Secretary for Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and now Chair of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, Randy Schriver, and Director of Rhodium Group's China practice, Oliver Melton. Tani Fukui from MetLife Investment Management did a wonderful job of chairing the panel. We dug deep into industrial policy and economic security, confronting the China challenge. I wanted to share the conversation with you on this episode of Betting on America. Enjoy. I'm Navin Girishankar.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for sticking it out deep into the afternoon here. I am very excited to be moderating this panel on industrial policy and economic security, confronting the China challenge. Perhaps not as fashionable a topic as AI, but in my view, perhaps more important. So I am very pleased to have a fairly substantial panel. Hopefully everybody gets a word in edgewise. We'll try to make that happen. I will start name and title, and then I will ask each of you to say a few words about where you are located in this discussion, in this debate. So from all the way to my left, Oliver Melton, Director of Rhodium Group. Then second, Randy Schriver, Commissioner and Vice Chair, U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And then Navin Girishankar, President, Economic Security and Technology Department, Center for Strategic and International Studies. And then Laura Taylor-Kale, Senior Fellow for Geoeconomics and Defense, Council of Foreign Relations. So let's start with Oliver. Please say a few words about where you're located in this discussion of industrial policy in China.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. I see some old friends out there, and it's good to be back in DC. I'm now at the Rhodium Group, but I'm only recently liberated from the U.S. government. Spent the last 15 years as a public servant, the last 5 in Beijing as the Treasury Attaché. So my position there was sort of on the front lines of the bilateral economic relationship. And before that, I spent 10 years as an analyst at the Department of State, where I focused on Chinese economics, but a lot on industrial policy and economic statecraft. At the Rhodium Group now, I run a team. I'm not the director of the Rhodium Group. I'm the director at the Rhodium Group, but I appreciate it. And my team covers real economy issues, trade, industrial policy, subsidies, critical materials, and supply chain security issues.
Thanks. Randy?
Great, thank you. Also very pleased to be here. I'm Randy Schriver. I am the chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. That's right. That's because nobody else wanted to do it this cycle, so I was promoted. We're a commission that advises the U.S. Congress on all things related to China. We make recommendations through an annual report every year and are also available to members and staff throughout the year as we do our cycle of hearings and travel and other research. We've been around since we were created by legislation in 2000 and stood up in 2001. So we're 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats who come up with a consensus report every year. So there's still bipartisanship and work across the aisles in some areas. But my background prior to that was a few tours in government. My last government position was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security. Former military officer, so I actually served in the embassy in Beijing in the Defense Attaché office as a naval officer. So I have watched more of the military and security issues historically, but certainly the convergence of economic trade issues with traditional security issues is something that now we all have to be on top of and abreast of.
Well, I'm honored to be here and to be on this panel with people who have served many tours in our government and our country. I head up the Economic Security and Technology Department at CSIS, where 50 residents, scholars, and 100 non-resident scholars focused on the singular mission of recommending to the U.S. government and its allies how to promote economic dynamism, the role of markets, and preserve technology advantages that will be essential to our growth and security. We're almost 2 years into our journey. Our research priorities are to define what economic security and the economic security toolkit are, assess how the U.S. stacks up against China on advanced technologies, understand the drivers of U.S. competitiveness going forward, and finally, explore what the future of technology and economic alliances are. And so we're quite excited about what we've been doing, and happy to share some of that with you today.
Good afternoon. I am also delighted to be here, although my commute was only about 15 minutes. I am Laura Taylor-Kale. I am currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, focused on geoeconomics and defense. I was also liberated from the US government about a year ago. I was the first Senate-confirmed presidentially appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial-Based Policy. I also have spent the last almost 20 plus years across the US government working on industrial policy and economic security. I've served at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is now the Development Finance Corporation. I served at Commerce, focused on manufacturing. I also began my career in the State Department. I was an economic officer in the Foreign Service working in Africa and Asia, and I've also worked at the World Bank. So I'm really delighted to be here and talk about the ways that the technology is changing how and why we're using industrial policy.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Now that I'm properly intimidated, let us start with the first question that I have, which is, how has economic policy evolved up to this point in the U.S., in China? Take your pick. And what have been the drivers of these industrial policy changes over the years? And we'll start again with Oliver at the end.
Great, thank you. So I'd say for China's industrial policy, and in particular the spillovers to the rest of the world, there's two really big drivers. The first is macroeconomic. They have a very high savings rate, a very relatively low consumption rate, which means that if investment isn't super high, then you end up with a really large trade surplus. We've been lucky in the last 10 years or so, or 15 years or so, there's been a super cycle of investment, particularly in urbanization and infrastructure, that has absorbed a large amount of that savings. But that's fading. The room for that is pretty much run out, or at least it's leveled off at a low level, which means that the pressure for China to run a large export surplus is extremely high. On top of that, the Chinese government is extremely active and deeply involved in the allocation of credit and resources inside the Chinese economy, so that this large pool of savings is redirected towards strategic sectors, advanced manufacturing, and tradable goods, which exacerbates this pressure that builds a trade surplus and also channels resources into sectors that are inherently strategic or sensitive to other countries. And China is motivated largely by a desire to eliminate dependence on foreign countries and to grow the economy through what I would say is somewhat of an obsession with manufacturing as a driver for productivity growth. And so these twin goals of eliminating dependence and moving up the value chain in advanced technologies leads China to target a really aggressive campaign of import substitution and really significant investments in basically every sector that other countries have, right? So they're targeting the Germans, they're targeting the Koreans, and the United States as well. And so this sort of inherently creates significant trade frictions. It also leads to really high levels of industrial concentration, supply chain concentration inside of China. There's a really strong push for foreign companies also to localize their production and R&D inside of China. And this exacerbates trade tensions, of course, but it also leads to supply chain concentration that we've seen the Chinese weaponize recently. So that's sort of the background for where we are. And where we're going, I would say, is we're going to see this movie again, right? We've seen the Chinese reevaluate their macroeconomic situation in the lead up to the 15th five-year plan. And there are going to be some tweaks, but they're going to be relatively modest and not sufficient to change the macroeconomic outlook. And we've seen them really double down on their industrial policy and technology goals. So it's really hard to imagine a world where we reach some sort of new equilibrium, barring some sort of really large scale trade interventions or a greater degree of trade friction and tariffs.
Okay, and just to throw a curveball, I've got a bit of a follow-up question, which is, you use the word obsession, manufacturing obsession, which is a strong word. Where does that come from, and how long does that persist?
I think it comes from sort of a planned economy distrust of services. So productivity gains in manufacturing, especially if you have export customers, are real. They're tangible. If a factory is efficient and competing on an international stage, you know that that's real growth. It's reliable. It's not an inflated statistic, and it's not protected by some sort of market distortions at home. And so I think there's a confidence that manufacturing is real productivity growth. Services is ephemeral and might be a distortion in the economy. So I think that's part of it. Second, I think that it's simple to reference Marxism in the context of the Chinese leadership, but I actually do think that there's a vestige of Marxist thinking about the control of technology as the source of all productivity growth. And I think that persists to today.
Okay, Randy, go ahead.
So I started working on China in the late 1980s, and I've been in several administrations, Democrat, Republican administrations. And my observation is we've always had a blend of engagement and optimism and some hedging and competitive aspects of the relationship. When I first started and the early years I worked on this, that wasn't uniform across agencies. It was DoD, military was sort of the hedge part. And our trade and economic policies were very forward-leaning and of the view that more is better, not only for United States companies, but that our engagement through the private sector, through investment, through joint ventures, et cetera, that it would be part of the toolkit that helps change China and modernize China and liberalize China and reform China. They'll see our business practices. They'll see, how labor standards are upheld, et cetera. But over time, I think because of the geopolitical tensions that my view created largely as a result of China growing more powerful and trying to seek outcomes that would fulfill its ambitions and its vision, which is quite different than our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific order. That sort of imbalance was unsustainable. And particularly on the DoD and military side, all of these policies related to trade and investment started to impact the mission of the defense enterprise in much more direct ways. Export controls. We found that through the release of technology, we were aiding Chinese military modernization in consequential ways. Supply chain, look at our reliance. I don't know, when you were at the Pentagon, hopefully things were a little better. We started asking questions of our defense primes, how reliant do you think you are on Chinese input, production, even elemental level? And we thought the answer was going to be bad and troubling. Like, ooh, that's a high number, but we can work with that and we can bring that down. The answer was much more troubling than we thought it was. We have no idea. Because after a second tier supplier, third, fourth tier, they didn't know. And so it turns out even, some of our most exquisite weapon systems that might come into play in a contingency with China were heavily reliant on Chinese input. And so, as we sort of entered a more competitive phase in the U.S.-China relationship, because of Chinese military civil fusion, because of our over-reliance on China for supply chains, these economic and trade issues really started to intersect more with traditional military and security issues. And so I think we're trying to deal with that, but it's quite incremental, and you basically have to disaggregate almost every weapon system to be able to do this and do it effectively. And as Defense suppliers will tell you, I can build an exquisite thing with 400 parts, but if I only have 399 of them, you don't have an exquisite thing. So the alternative is we're reliant on China in very significant ways. And in the event of a contingency involving U.S. and China, we could be cut off, and that's not something that is really acceptable risk. So.
And if you, just to pinpoint a rough date on when this narrative started changing, when do you think that was?
People sort of say China became more assertive and started acting out on their ambitions 2008, 2009 timeframe. So really pre-Xi Jinping, and people point to the great financial crisis and the feeling that China's day had come and we were a declining power and it was going to be a more precipitous decline than previously expected. But it was really sort of the end of the Obama administration. So from 2008-9 to the latter part of the second Obama term, some people point to a meeting in the Rose Garden of the White House where Xi Jinping promised not to militarize the South China Sea and then militarized the South China Sea. And, that sort of led to the Trump administration, which I served in, but I always describe the Trump administration as more evolutionary than revolutionary. A lot of the competitive posture had been initiated by the Obama administration. They didn't put such a fine point on it with some of the terminology like strategic competition, but really that's where the Trump administration took it. And we've sort of been on that trajectory to the present.
I think both of them have said it well. The way I think about this is that over the last 10 plus years, we're experiencing 4 China shocks. The import shock, which most economists have been discussing for some time, and its impact, while it's up for debate on economic dislocations here in the US. What I would consider a dual use or civil military fusion shock, and a recognition that a broader swath of commercial technologies are now dual use technologies. A bad actor shock or a malign actor shock, which includes IP theft, cybersecurity issues. And these are known. These are well known. In fact, this has led to the evolution of a number of economic security policies, both defensive and then I would argue some offensive. But the one that hasn't received enough attention or should receive more attention is what I would call an innovation shock. And for me, that means that we are no longer the locus for global innovation across advanced technologies, that there are technologies more and more where China is leading, whether it's on the scale and scope of R&D and the quality of R&D even, for example, in life sciences, or whether it's simply in the speed of lab to market transitions and the commercialization of R&D, and obviously in diffusion. And so we've got to wrap our heads around that. And I feel that the current tariff agenda has in some ways distracted us from zeroing in on this. Now, what has happened is this evolution and explosion over the last decade in economic security policies. This is really quite new for someone like my age, I think, who understood economics in a certain way. Now you can't really be an effective economic policy a designer in the United States if you don't integrate national security, technology, and global markets. And so hence the notion that you need to think about both dynamism as well as technology advantages. And sometimes those cut against each other. So when you look at these economic security policies that we've all worked on, I had the opportunity in the last administration with Secretary Raimondo and DepSec Graves to see that they've evolved in a way that we are supporting industrial promotion, including with the very robust role of the state in productive activities, again, startling, to defense tools like export controls, inbound, outbound, investment screening, and other such things. And I would say relatively anemic partnership policies, meaning if you're not providing market access or you don't have deep pockets, there's a limit to what you can do in terms of partnerships, but we're still trying. These are in tension. You want to put tariffs in place, that cuts against your partners. You want to put export controls in place, it cuts at the revenues of the companies that need to plow money back into R&D. And so these tensions are real, and there may be no way out of it unless we find a way back to secure and trusted markets and technology markets. We have to find a way back to the time-tested, stress-tested drivers of innovation, commercialization, and scaling. And how do you do that? I feel we are at a risk of overcorrecting with respect to the role of the state in many activities that are productive in the productive sector. And it's quite startling to see. And we might have to find our way back, and we'll come back when you do a second round. But I reflect on the AIPA ruling, and I hope that perhaps this gives a moment of pause, both in the Congress as well as generally and in the administration, to say, how do we pivot from tariffs to technology? How do we pivot from protectionism to projection of our economic power and might in a way that we frankly sorely need?
So you discussed about, and I think you touched on this a little bit, the tariffs cutting against our greater goals. There's specific ways in which those are really contradictory. Do you have a specific example of something
Well, the
really
way
contradictory?
I put out something some time ago saying you can't fight a tech war if you're fighting a trade war. And what I meant by that is across these advanced technologies, these technology value chains are global in nature, meaning a number of partners are involved in these. And so when, we've seen this kind of rather uncertain, volatile way in which the tariffs have been put in place, how much of this have we thought through when it comes to, okay, what's needed to compete on quantum? What's needed to compete on chips? What's needed to compete on biotech? And are these tariff policies cutting against what's needed from a cost competitiveness basis and other ways to actually get us there?
So you're talking about tariff barriers against other countries, not
Right.
necessarily China.
Right, meaning
Okay.
key partners, our networks. We have to defend our networks. Well, we can't undercut our networks. And so the question is, are we doing that?
Okay. Yeah, all right.
Wonderful. Well, the wonderful thing about this panel is that we have such expertise on here. And so being the last person to give sort of beginning remarks, all I can say is I agree with everything that they've said. A couple of things I want to add on and sort of build on, particularly around some of Navin's comments about the innovation shock. I think that's a great way of putting it. That innovation shock has happened both on the commercial side and on the defense side, right? And so part of the reason why we are where we are right now is because of these tensions around technological advances. And really, it's about diffusion and technological sort of primacy. The platforms that we have that we're advancing for the future really do depend on a level of uptake and diffusion that's really critical, both on the commercial side and on the defense side. So in the ways in which that China has invested and expanded in research and R&D, I would also argue that the way in which Chinese technologists operate on the global scale, particularly in parts of the world where technologies, the quantum technologies may not be ones that populations will be able to pick up very quickly. But when I was researching this in China in 2018, I saw entrepreneurs innovating in 2G. And you think to yourself, well, what's the point of 2G? Well, 2G is great, especially if you are in most populous parts of the world, like Africa and Southeast Asia, where primary systems are on 2G and 3G. You're not getting to some of these more advanced systems. So the technology aspect of it is critically important on the commercial side as well as on the defense side. I think part of what is fascinating about this time period, for defense, part of the reason why the Congress established a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial-Based Policy was to elevate the role. And this happened in 2021 with the National Defense Authorization Act. I was nominated in 22 and then came in after a 10-month Senate-facilitated sabbatical, as I like to call it, a confirmation process, came in 2023. But part of the reason was this recognition that the ways in which we had operated in industrial policy, and particularly in the defense space, where it hasn't necessarily been as disputed as in the commercial spaces. We've been doing industrial policy in the defense sector for well over 100 years. The recognition that what we were doing was too diffuse and too dispersed and needed much more of a senior level focus. I think we're entering another phase where looking at these innovation shocks, I think there's also an investment shock as well. And so the tools of industrial policy that we've typically used and certainly see now are the tariffs, the export controls, investment reviews, intellectual property policies. But there are the positive tools as well. There's export credits and promotion. There's catalytic capital like loans and loan guarantees. The CHIPS Act was part of that. Defense Production Act, Title III, SIBRs and SITRs, the things that startups and technology companies are pretty familiar with. These are all becoming even more critical components and frankly, components of our industrial policy where the administration and Congress are putting more and more resources. Equity stakes is another area that I'm currently writing on. So along with all of these tools that we've had in the past on the punitive measures, we're now advancing and pushing forward much more enthusiastically across political spectrums on these positive tools. So where will that leave us? I think, there are folks that worry that we are becoming too China-like with our state economic policies and our interventions. I actually think that over the next year or so, I think this is going to come to a head where there'll be much more domestic tensions and debates on how we use these tools. I think the IEPA ruling is certainly a step that will sort of continue to engender that conversation. But we also have the reauthorization of the Defense Production Act coming up this year. And I suspect that equity stakes will be a critical part of that discussion as the administration and Congress try to figure out what are the avenues in which the government can take stakes in equity stakes in companies. So, on top of all of these issues around our strategic competition with China, the types of technological tools that we have and our desire to maintain an advantage with these technologies, there's also these questions of how do we use the tools, particularly the more positive tools that we have in our toolkit.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Laura. Okay. So I think I think one of the really important points here, and just to give you a heads up, Laura, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. So you get to start off this portion of it. I think one of the reasons why we have this panel is exactly what Navin has said, which is you can't do or discuss economics at this point at this moment in time without having a more deep understanding of the national security implications and these other these things that we sort of call exogenous inputs into our models. So I guess looking forward, when we talk about the future of these industrial policies, what do you see as where we're going, where we should go? And perhaps one important point is, what are the guardrails for the appropriate policy? What is it that is required from a national security perspective? This is something I don't know. And as opposed to, and then we can sort of make the evaluation from an economics perspective, is that how good or how penalizing is it from an economic perspective? But what's required, what needs to happen from a national security perspective to go forward, to do what we need to do as a nation?
So I think the two greatest threats that we have are time and the time the time and balance between the interventions that are needed and ways we need the market to change and the time that, the market will actually change. So that's sort of the justification for a lot of these policies. But I actually think we are dealing with some other fundamental issues. I think we have real institutional challenges at this point. So we've gone forward with addressing a lot of our market challenges, whether it's supply chain issues, whether it's critical minerals and rare earths or semiconductors, and almost a reactionary sort of mode, right? But the truth is, I've been studying this for a long time. Over the last 250 years, our economic policies have, I think, been intentionally diffuse across the economic branches of the government. They are even pretty diffuse across the various bodies and committees in Congress. I don't think that's going to work going forward. I think that we need much more coherence and much better, more strategic approach to how we arrange our institutions. The Council on Foreign Relations just recently published this report on U.S. economic security. It's part of the reason I'm here. Have to advertise for my organization. It's free, you can download it. Former Secretary Raimondo, former Deputy Secretary of Treasury, Justin Mucinich, and the CEO of Lockheed Martin, Jim Tacklet, were the co-chairs of this task force. But we really propose several recommendations for ways in which the U.S. government can more coherently address economic security issues. And one of the recommendations was around our institutions on economic security. I know Navin has also written about this as well. I do think that is a real fundamental challenge. And until we're able to address an understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve, what we want the end goal to look like, and how we harness our institutions, whether we pick up the detritus of broken institutions, ill-fitting institutions, to create something new or whatever. I think that's something that we have to address.
I would love to piggyback on that. First of all, let me start with the last point. I wrote an essay recently arguing that America needs economic warriors, and it was a provocative piece, but what I meant by that is that we need to think about, just as you have said, the structure of our economic security apparatus within government, perhaps right there in the National Security Council with a focus on economic security issues. We have to think about the people that do this work across defensive tools, sort of industrial promotion tools, partnership tools, and label them as economic security professionals. And we also need to encourage our universities and our public policy schools to drive much more research around this intersection of economics, technology, and national security, because that will make for better policy. And all of these pieces need to be put in place. We are far behind. If you look after the Doge exercise, and if you look at where we are now, some of the bureaus, you'll excuse my terminology here, look like Swiss cheese. We have an opportunity to rebuild this, and we should do this ASAP because God knows the PRC is moving. So that's the how, but let's just step back on the what. We got to tout my own report, the Tech Edge report, which we recently put out. We started with a simple question: what drives sustained technology leadership? And there are two things. One is ecosystems. So it's the policies, it's the companies, it's the universities that work together within global markets to support technology advantages. Everything from R&D and lab to market transitions, commercialization, and diffusion. Ecosystems. But that's not all. And we looked at different types of technologies. And we identified 4 stack technologies, where they are basically general purpose technologies that are highly complex in terms of production. Production technologies like like high-end machine tools. Precision technologies like jet engines. and base technologies like rare earths that has been mentioned. We need to be able to play all the keys on the keyboard. Why? Because these technologies are interconnected. So if you want to play the technology long game and beat China, you can't just pick AI. You have to understand that under AI are all these other pieces that are related to, say, rare earths or digital networks and so on and so forth. You got to play all the keys. Two, speed to scale. God knows we have a problem with speed, how long it takes to actually get licensing for a mine or any other such thing. Third, you have to defend your networks. And what's happening now with the trade agenda, frankly, is we have alienated the very players that we need to expand and extend our capabilities, whether it's Japan on high-end machine tools or the Europeans in some of these areas as well. So I think that our perspective on this is if you assess how China and the US stack up against each other, there are some areas where they're ahead, like rare earths and base technologies. There's some areas where we're ahead, like stack technologies. And precision technologies like jet engines. But there are other areas where neither the US nor China is ahead. And that's the game right there. How do we build the alliances we need to be able to project power over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, these were terrific comments. Thank you. I guess I have to plug my report too. So but this is
Everyone has a report.
This is interesting because we do an annual report, the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission. Number one recommendation, and we vote, so it was the number one out of 30, was to create a single entity USG economic statecraft entity. I didn't say that exactly well, but basically to have a reorganization that enables better economic statecraft and really to take the various pieces and put them under one leadership with clear direction. So we're all singing from the same hymnal here for sure. I think in the short term, I don't see how we get out of this sort of somewhat chaotic, somewhat impulsive use of these economic tools. Even the Supreme Court decision seemed to launch us into more, not less. President Trump will go to Beijing in April and is probably looking for the big, beautiful deal. And he may get an agreement to buy more stuff, which is pretty typical of these summits. He may get an agreement on process. We get a lot of working groups. We get a lot of high-level exchanges dedicated to specific topics. But what we're likely going to get ultimately is dashed expectations because the Chinese rarely live up to their commitments and don't meet our expectations. So I think we're in this period of competition for as far as my eyes can see. I think the good news is Trump, at least in the Indo-Pacific, has greater appreciation for what allies bring to the equation for us. Very much, and I served in the first Trump term. A lot of the narrative was our allies were burdens on us. They weren't paying their fair share. We weren't being paid enough to protect them. Narratives that to me seem disconnected to what our alliances and partnerships were about. But if you look at the recent engagements, and I would point to President Lee of Korea, Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan, Prime Minister Albanese in Australia, what are we getting? We're getting shipbuilding cooperation with South Korea. We're getting critical minerals, rare earth cooperation with Australia. We're getting tech cooperation and consortium building in terms of buyer's market for all these critical minerals with Japan. We're getting a lot more cooperation, and I think that's a recognition that what we need is really a number of countries of advanced economies that are themselves producers of high technology as well as consumers, but really sort of bounding together in ways that create efficiencies, create divisions of labor, but really sort of better position us for this competition. So we're not fighting a trade war while we're fighting a tech war and probably doing not well at either. So.
Okay,
Good, thank you. Well, I share the concern or pessimism that in the next 6 to 12 or 18 months, we're going to have to reevaluate the use of industrial policy tools inside the United States. And I think we can actually learn quite a bit from the Chinese experience here. The Chinese are incredibly aggressive about their industrial policies. They have myriad tools and millions of dollars or billions and billions of dollars worth of subsidies But Chinese policymakers are also intimately familiar with all of the failings, and they will tell you, they will regale you with stories of failure and everything they've tried that didn't work out or that led to corruption or inefficiency or market abuses. It just didn't work, right? So they're pessimistic about industrial policies, except for the fact that it's the only way to achieve what they want to achieve. And I would say that we have lessons. I haven't written a report about this yet, but maybe I should just for next year. But so keep your eye out. But looking at both the tools and the strategy, I would say that there are lessons that we could draw from the Chinese. On the tool side, a lot of what we've been doing so far has been on upstream. It's been on indirect or direct subsidies for supply, for investment. And the Chinese learned a while ago that that's insufficient. It breeds corruption, it breeds waste, it breeds misallocation of resources. And so what they've started to do more of is to pair capital support for capital expenditure on the upstream side with demand on the downstream side. And they've actually really shifted to the demand side to crowd in private capital. And so they want to make sure that they provide enough capital to different stages in the supply chain to make sure that there aren't bottlenecks. But they also want to make sure that, and this is incredibly important for them, that there's competition in every single node in the supply chain. Because what they don't want to do is accidentally create a situation where one company can monopolize or can leverage its market power to basically be lazy and not be innovative. And so I think that full supply chain approach is really valuable, and I think that we need to think more about that. In that context, they also think about how subsidies or support for upstream suppliers trickles down into and feeds the development of downstream suppliers. And so you see really differentiated policies where you have upstream monopolies, state-owned monopolies, where the state's equity is used basically to push firms to engage in non-market practices, to lose money, right? But they do that upstream so that it's a type of subsidy that feeds into the downstream sectors. And that's actually how they got into the position that they're in with critical materials, is they were doing it to build out the higher value-added magnets and motors. It wasn't exclusively to weaponize later on. It was to use lower priced inputs to feed higher value-added downstream sectors. And I think we need to think in that sort of full value chain perspective as well. And even right now, I think it's really positive that we've started to talk about price floors for critical materials. I think that's really important for a variety of reasons. But it's important to remember that also actually increases your costs for those downstream producers who are going to be then competing against Chinese or other suppliers. So I think we need to take a much more comprehensive approach. And I would argue that we've done pretty well deploying these upstream sort of subsidies for investment or for new supply. But we also need to pivot to downstream demand as well.
Yeah. Interesting, very interesting. So we'll be taking some notes on economic development from China, perhaps. Okay, so a few questions. I do have a little bit of time here. I think one of these is an interesting question here. What about the Western Hemisphere? And is that a potential for a type of Belt and Road initiative for the U.S.? The Pan American road? I don't know what that road is. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I personally think it makes a lot of sense. The question is how you do it. And the Chinese spent hundreds of billions of dollars on Belt and Road and then quickly realized that it was not particularly effective in many cases. It didn't necessarily get them what they wanted, and they took on enormous losses. The best way to do it would be to incentivize investment in Mexico or other countries. And the best way to do that is with a tariff differential. And the trade strategy to date has not really focused on ensuring that there's a maximum and credible differential between China and other potential suppliers. In fact, there's been a huge amount of ambiguity, and originally the tariffs on Mexico were higher than the tariffs on China. And now with the IEEPA ruling, it's going to be harder to construct a delta between China tariffs and other countries' tariffs, or a large enough delta to incentivize really rapid investment.
Let me take a stab at it, and these may sound somewhat contradictory. I'm a 20-year world banker, and one of the things that I found troubling over the years was that at our multilateral development organizations, if you look at the track record on ICB procurements, international competitive bidding procurements on civil works, the lion's share are won by PRC-linked companies. So we are advocating for, more aggressively use the World Bank's balance sheet, increase the flow from IDA, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And I also know that there are other parts of even the US government where the downstream part of procurement is not part of the equation. So we're advocating for more money, but we're not thinking about who are the people winning the tenders on the back end. So we have to think about, I don't know if we can have a turnkey solution like the PRC, but we should have a more coordinated solution. And if you forget what's happening on the downstream, then you're actually potentially like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's one. And I think we should look at the full range of instruments that we either directly own or that we finance to see if this is being done carefully. Secondly, I do think that, sure, hemisphere, you want to start in the hemisphere, fine, but it can't be the only solution. We're not a regional power. We have to think globally. And I think there's an opportunity here if we can think of some new tools. And the administration deserves a lot of credit in terms of what it's done with critical minerals, what it's done with packed silica. Let's think of these things in a way that combines market access with deep pockets. I worked on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I'll be very honest about this. I think our challenge, despite a lot of work, was that we couldn't offer either of those things. And so our partners were saying, okay, so what are you offering us? Oh, we can talk and monitor supply chains and we could share information in real time. Okay, and then what? So I think we have to think about these tools that we have inherited and figure out how we can ratchet them. And my final point here is, with the international agencies, we do have a conversation to be had about how we balance the role of China in these institutions with our national security goals. And that is something that we have not had yet. So,
Well, we also have to be actually engaged in these international organizations in
True.
order to be
To do
part
it.
of those conversations.
Yeah.
I'd also like to add, so the interesting thing about the Western Hemisphere question is the Western Hemisphere, the rest of the Western Hemisphere, Canada, Mexico, Central America, South America, has a very long history with us. Similar to China and its relations with its partners in Southeast Asia, right? I do think that there are opportunities that we're missing, that we're overlooking, particularly with our neighbors to the north. I don't think that a lot of the rhetoric of economic warfare is sitting well with Canada. Our defense industrial bases are particularly interconnected across those borders. If we're looking at building out capacity for greater onshoring of rare earth magnet development, mine to magnet strategies and things like that, that we started in the Biden administration and the Trump administration is really accelerating, we're going to need the cooperation. We're going to need the resources. We're going to need the energy sources from Canada, from Mexico, some of these areas of importing critical materials, raw materials will come from Brazil, will come from other parts of the Western Hemisphere. I think right now, as much as we talk about the challenges with Europe, I think, and sort of where the Europeans are with the United States, I think there's even more challenge and sort of rancor beyond just whether or not the U.S. wins the hockey at the Winter Olympics. We have some serious issues that we need to address with our Canadian and the rest of our Western Hemisphere colleagues in order to advance this.
All right. Let me squeeze one question in here. Maybe one person gets to respond. What does winning look like? What's the end goal here? Anybody want to venture?
We're winning now, right?
You're not tired of winning yet? I think one of the reasons we chose the phrase strategic competition is because it can be an enduring state. You compete, maybe not in perpetuity, but without a particular end time in mind, which doesn't mean there's not particular goals and objectives associated with it. But when you think about it in terms of competition that could be quite prolonged, it's really about maintaining critical capabilities that give you an edge in particular sectors so that you're the first mover that gets to define the rules. You're the first mover that gets to be able to define the order. And we always, in the Indo-Pacific, talked about upholding a free and open order. that gets challenged daily, that gets challenged weekly, monthly, et cetera. So despite the rhetoric of the president under which I served, winning is sometimes just outcompeting over a prolonged period of time and maintaining an edge. That's how I see it.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for all your comments.